General Hospital will reveal the custody hearing for Wiley and Amelia unfolded in an atmosphere so tense it felt as though the very air inside the courtroom had thickened. Every eye was locked onto Michael, who had returned to Port Charles barely a week earlier after undergoing intensive treatment at a clinic in Baden-Baden for serious burn injuries. His sudden appearance in court sent ripples through the gallery, especially given the widely circulated rumors about his compromised health and the fragile state he had left behind in Germany. But to those who truly knew him, it came as no surprise. Michael had always been a man who would go to any length for the people he loved, especially his children. Carly, driven by a deep-rooted sense of urgency and maternal instinct, had taken matters into her own hands while Michael was still abroad recovering. Despite repeated warnings from those close to her, including Jason and Diane, she had moved forward with the custody petition, convinced that any delay would only allow Drew and Willow to further cement their hold over the children. In Carly's mind, the scandalous nature of Drew's behavior and his increasingly volatile relationship with Willow offered a strong chance to wrest custody back into more stable hands, either Michael's or, in his absence, her own. She believed the court would see through Drew's recent facade and recognize the instability that had seeped into the Quartermain household, especially in light of the evidence she was prepared to present. Among that evidence were highly compromising surveillance videos showing Drew and Willow in a deeply inappropriate encounter, caught intimately entangled on the floor of the Quartermain playroom. A space meant for children's innocence, now tainted with adult indiscretion. Carly's team, spearheaded by the ever-formidable Diane, also prepared to attack Drew's credibility by drawing attention to his altered mental state, likely a result of ketamine exposure, possibly administered without his consent by Tracy, who herself now faced criminal charges. The morning of the hearing, anticipation simmered like a storm cloud ready to burst. No one was prepared for the sight that met them when Michael entered the courtroom. Dressed in a dark suit that hung loosely from his gaunt frame, his steps were measured and labored. His complexion was pale, the healthy vibrancy in his skin replaced by a waxy pallor that spoke volumes of the pain he had endured, and was still enduring. Yet his posture remained erect, his eyes unwavering, and his presence exuded an unspoken plea, to be seen not as a victim of circumstance, but as a father who had returned from the edge of death to stand for his children. As the hearing commenced, the judge invited the parties to present their arguments and evidence. Carly took the lead, introducing footage that shocked the room into stunned silence. The images were damning: Drew and Willow, caught in an embrace that could not be misconstrued, right in the middle of a space that had once echoed with the laughter of Wiley and Amelia. The judge, visibly displeased, took notes silently. Diane followed, building on Carly's groundwork by outlining Drew's troubling descent into erratic behavior, citing not just his recent sexual misconduct, but the possible chemical tampering by Tracy that had influenced his state of mind. Willow, seated quietly beside Drew, could do little but lower her eyes as the footage played. The weight of betrayal and embarrassment fell heavy on her shoulders, and for the first time since their relationship began, she looked at Drew with something bordering on regret. Drew himself, normally articulate and composed, seemed uncharacteristically mute. His legal counsel made weak objections, but the damage had been done, the evidence was overwhelming, the narrative shifting rapidly against them. But just as momentum swung decisively in Michael's favor, fate delivered a cruel blow. As Diane concluded her searing cross-examination and returned to her seat, Michael's hand, which had been clenched into a white-knuckled fist atop the table, began to tremble. Beads of sweat formed at his temple, and a shadow of pain passed across his features. He tried to steady his breathing, to appear unfazed, but his body betrayed him. In the space of a few seconds, his complexion turned ashen, his chest heaved as if straining for air, and then, he collapsed. The courtroom descended into chaos. Jason was the first to leap from his seat, rushing to his side, shouting for a medic. Carly screamed, frozen in horror as she saw her son crumpled on the floor, unresponsive. Paramedics stormed in within minutes, stabilizing Michael as best they could before wheeling him out on a stretcher. The official report would later confirm what many already feared: Michael had suffered a cardiac episode. A heart attack triggered by complications from his untreated burn trauma and the sheer physical and emotional strain of the hearing. In an instant, the entire tone of the custody case shifted. The judge, visibly shaken, declared an indefinite postponement of the proceedings pending a full medical evaluation of Michael's condition. No new custody arrangements would be made, leaving Wiley and Amelia legally under the care of Drew and Willow for the time being. Carly, once so sure of her calculated risk, was left devastated by the consequences of her ambition. What was meant to be a legal victory had become a personal tragedy, her son's life now hanging in the balance. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras clicking rapidly, eager to capture the downfall of a man who had risen too soon. Speculation ran rampant: was Michael pushed too hard? Was his health irreparably compromised? And most painfully, had his last-ditch effort to regain his children cost him everything? Inside the hospital, Michael lay unconscious, hooked to machines that hummed rhythmically with each fragile heartbeat. Doctors fought to stabilize him, unsure of what permanent damage the heart attack may have caused. Jason remained by his side, silently vowing to protect what remained of Michael's legacy. While Carly sat outside his room, unable to forgive herself for pushing him into the courtroom before he was ready. Meanwhile, Willow wandered the halls alone, her thoughts a swirling tempest of guilt, confusion, and a dawning realization that perhaps she, too, had failed to protect the man who once loved her unconditionally. The echo of her children's laughter, the ghost of Michael's hands cradling Amelia, haunted her with every step. Port Charles held its breath. The court of law had gone silent. But the court of conscience had only just begun. Whether Michael would wake, whether he would heal, and whether he would ever hold his children again, those answers remained uncertain. But one truth was now painfully clear: love, when mixed with desperation, ambition, and timing, can lead to a heartbreak no judgment can repair. Just when it seemed the momentum had finally shifted in Michael's favor, an unexpected and devastating turn of events brought the courtroom to a halt. Carly had just completed her final statements, an impassioned and aggressive plea layered with damning evidence against Drew and Willow, when a subtle yet disturbing change overcame Michael. Those seated closest to him noticed it first: the sudden glisten of cold sweat forming on his forehead, the slight tremble in his fingers as he clutched the edge of the courtroom bench. His breathing became shallow and erratic, and despite his efforts to appear strong, something within him was unraveling. His body, already weakened from extensive burn injuries and the strain of international travel against medical advice, was reaching its limit. Without warning, Michael's back arched as if struck by an invisible force, his chest heaved violently, and he collapsed forward with a dull, sickening thud. Gasps echoed across the courtroom as the room fell into chaos. His face turned deathly pale, devoid of color and life, while his chest convulsed uncontrollably. Jason, seated only a few feet away, immediately sprang into action, shouting for emergency medical help. A physician, coincidentally present in court as part of another case, rushed to Michael's side, checking for a pulse and beginning immediate chest compressions. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge: Michael had suffered a serious cardiac event. A heart attack brought on by the extreme stress of the trial, compounded by lingering complications from the untreated burns he had sustained weeks prior. His premature return to Port Charles, against the firm warnings of his doctors in Germany, had now led to a life-threatening collapse in the very courtroom where he had hoped to reclaim his children. As the paramedics arrived and began preparing to transport him to General Hospital, a haunting stillness settled over the room. Carly stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. She had pushed for this hearing, believing it to be the only way to protect Wiley and Amelia. Yet the man lying unconscious before her was her son, the very person she was trying to fight for, now a casualty of her ambition and haste. The crushing realization that her actions may have jeopardized his life settled in with suffocating weight. The judge, visibly shaken by the ordeal, had no choice but to suspend the custody hearing indefinitely. He announced that no temporary decision regarding custody would be issued until Michael's physical and psychological state could be properly assessed by an independent medical team. The court would reconvene only when it was clear that Michael was medically fit to represent himself and participate in further proceedings. For the time being, Drew and Willow would retain full legal guardianship over Wiley and Amelia, much to the dismay of Carly and her legal team. Word of Michael's collapse spread like wildfire throughout Port Charles. Within hours, every corner of the city was abuzz with whispers, speculation, and concern. The media picked up the story, flashing headlines that read custody trial turns tragic. Michael Corinthos hospitalized after heart attack. Citizens who once rallied behind Carly now began to question her motives, accusing her of putting her own pride and control above the well-being of her son. The very people who had once championed her efforts now viewed her with growing disapproval and criticism. Within the walls of General Hospital, Michael was rushed into intensive care, surrounded by machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath. Jason stayed at his bedside, a stoic guardian refusing to leave him alone, silently hoping his best friend would wake. Carly, guilt-ridden and numb, remained in the waiting room for hours, racked with anxiety and self-blame. She replayed the events of the trial in her mind repeatedly, every word, every choice, now tainted with the knowledge of what it had cost. Willow, emotionally conflicted and lost in her own turmoil, took on the quiet responsibility of caring for the children. Despite the storm of public opinion, she kept Wiley and Amelia shielded from the media frenzy and clung to the structure of daily routine as a means of survival. Yet even as she tucked them into bed and prepared their meals, her mind drifted to Michael's hospital room. The image of him falling to the courtroom floor haunted her, a brutal reminder of how fragile and unpredictable life had become. She hadn't expected to feel anything at this point, too much had passed between them, but what lingered was not bitterness, but sorrow. Drew, reeling from both the scandal of the trial and Michael's collapse, withdrew from public life in the days that followed. He canceled appointments, declined interviews, and avoided social engagements. While some interpreted his silence as guilt, others saw it as self-preservation. Deep inside, he was beginning to confront the possibility that his actions had played a role in Michael's deterioration. Though he tried to reassure Willow that things would eventually stabilize, he knew the emotional damage might be irreversible. And as for Port Charles, it found itself divided. Some viewed Michael as a hero, a father who had risked everything to reclaim his children. Others saw him as reckless, blinded by emotion and unwilling to prioritize his own recovery. But regardless of public opinion, one truth resonated in every heart. This trial was no longer just about custody, it had become a battle for life itself. Every passing hour felt like a century as the city waited for updates on Michael's condition. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic, but the road ahead was uncertain. Even if he survived, the strain on his heart might leave lasting effects, impacting his ability to parent or even live independently. Legal questions now mingled with medical ones. Would he ever be able to stand trial again? Would he recover in time to mount a renewed custody case? And what of Carly? Would she now accept the limitations of her role, or would she fight harder, fueled by guilt rather than clarity? As the night deepened and the lights of General Hospital flickered softly in the dark, only one thing was certain: Port Charles had witnessed the fall of a man who had dared to defy fate for the love of his children. Whether he would rise again remained uncertain, but for now, the city, his family, and the children he had tried to protect could only wait, hoping that somewhere within the stillness of a hospital room, Michael's heart would find the strength to beat again. Jason, who had stood by Michael since the very beginning of his recovery, now bore a burden heavier than any he had carried before. In the past, he had been Michael's protector, confidant, and silent guardian, but now he found himself fighting for something far more abstract, and far more fragile: Michael's legacy, his dignity, and the last shred of hope that remained for a father who had sacrificed everything in a desperate act of love. with Michael lying unconscious in the ICU. Breathing through tubes and surrounded by machines that dictated his every heartbeat, Jason took it upon himself to become the voice Michael no longer had. Unwilling to accept the court's passive silence in the wake of Michael's collapse, Jason began working quietly behind the scenes, meeting with legal advisors, consulting with specialists, and drafting a formal petition to the judge. His goal was to convince the court to allow an independent medical panel to assess Michael's condition, not just through the narrow lens of his heart attack, but through the broader context of his emotional resilience, his paternal instincts, and the physical risks he had willingly endured for the sake of his children. Jason believed that if the court could understand the magnitude of Michael's sacrifice, his decision to abandon treatment prematurely, to risk his life by appearing in court despite severe physical debilitation, then perhaps the judge would see the man behind the patient, the father behind the diagnosis. But the road ahead was perilous. Michael's medical team at General Hospital remained cautious. Preliminary scans revealed not just cardiac distress but signs of inflammation around the heart wall, potentially indicative of pericardial complications from his earlier burn injuries. The doctors warned that any attempt to remove Michael from a monitored setting, even for testimony or evaluation, could trigger another cardiac event. The fear of permanent damage loomed over every decision. If his heart had sustained lasting trauma, Michael might require long-term medication, lifestyle changes, and in the worst case, surgical intervention. And with these possibilities came the haunting question of his future as a parent: would the court deem him physically fit to care for two young children? Or would this single health crisis be used to define the rest of his life? Outside the hospital walls, the world of Port Charles wrestled with its own reckoning. The custody battle, once a bitter legal dispute, had transformed into a human tragedy, one that forced everyone involved to examine their motives, mistakes, and moral compasses. Carly, once the fierce matriarch who believed she was acting in her family's best interest, found herself haunted by regret. In the sterile quiet of the hospital waiting room, she replayed every conversation, every decision that led to this point. Her determination had been unshakable. But now she was left wondering if her tunnel vision had blinded her to what Michael truly needed: healing, rest, and the assurance that he didn't need to prove himself in a courtroom to be seen as a loving father. Jason never once condemned her. Instead, he channeled his energy into protecting Michael's reputation, coordinating updates with the legal team, and reaching out to allies both inside and outside the courtroom. He knew time was running short. The longer Michael remained unconscious, the greater the chance that the court would allow Drew and Willow's temporary guardianship to solidify into a permanent arrangement. And while Jason did not doubt Willow's love for the children, he questioned whether she had the strength to see past her current entanglement with Drew and recognize what Michael had risked to protect his family. For Willow, the days following Michael's collapse were a torment of inner conflict. She had not expected this. She had not expected to see the man who once held her hand through cancer treatments, who had stood by her when others faltered, now lying silent and pale beneath the artificial glow of ICU monitors. She had made choices, some driven by resentment, others by misguided loyalty, and now she couldn't escape the weight of them. Each time she walked into Amelia's room or tucked Wiley into bed, Michael's absence screamed louder than any voice in her head. And somewhere within her, the truth began to emerge: she still cared. Not just about what Michael meant to the children, but about what he had once meant to her. Drew, meanwhile, had retreated from public view, though the media was kinder to him than to Carly. Especially after the scandal involving Tracy and the possible ketamine poisoning, Drew knew his credibility had taken a hit. He had been caught on video in an indefensible act with Willow. And while the court had not yet ruled against him, he could feel the judgment radiating from every corner of the community. Worse still, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that his presence in Willow's life, rather than offering her stability, had brought nothing but division and pain. For now, he stayed quiet, letting Willow take the lead with the children, while he questioned whether his involvement in their lives had caused more harm than good. Across town, families whispered about the collapse of the Corinthos legacy. Some speculated that Michael's health would never recover. Others mourned the loss of a man who had once been a symbol of strength and resilience. But for Jason, the whispers didn't matter. What mattered was the next move, assembling the right doctors, drafting the right motion, and preparing for the next courtroom battle. Because if Michael ever woke up, he would want to fight. And Jason would make sure he had the chance. Still, as night fell over Port Charles and the lights in General Hospital flickered softly against the dark sky, there remained more questions than answers. Would Michael recover? Or would he live with permanent damage that altered the course of his life forever? Would Carly find redemption, or would guilt consume her? Would Willow find the courage to break free from Drew's shadow and acknowledge the depth of Michael's sacrifice? And would the court, often blind to the emotional nuances behind legal decisions, see in Michael not a broken body, but a devoted father who had given everything he had? In the end, time would be the only judge. Not the one who sat behind a gavel, but the one that moved silently forward, testing the endurance of love, the strength of regret, and the resilience of the human heart. For now, all anyone could do was wait, and hope that when Michael opened his eyes again, the world would be ready to see him not as the man who collapsed, but as the father who rose, again and again. For the sake of his children.